Kevin McCullar is one of the most exciting players in college basketball this season. What has his strong start for Kansas done for his NBA draft stock? We're going to discuss that and some NBA draft sleepers on today's Locked On College Basketball podcast.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Thursday. Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Well, it continues to be a slow week in college basketball, leading into some exciting games this weekend as we get closer to the new year. I am thrilled to be joined today by our weekly contributor, Leaf Tulane. Leaf's not only a regular guest here on Locked On College Basketball, he also contributes to the Locked On NBA Big Board. If you guys have not checked out, the Locked On NBA Big Board is a fantastic show, multiple rotating guests led by Rafael Barlow, talking all things NBA draft and prospects. Fantastic show. And since it's a little slow right now, Leaf and I are going to kind of put on our NBA draft hats, as it were, and start looking at a couple of guys who have risen up draft boards so far this season, few guys who have fallen on draft boards. We'll talk a little bit about Isaiah Collier and what's going on with him at USC. And then we'll talk about some sleepers, maybe some veteran guys, some older upperclassmen who have kind of put themselves in the conversation, especially in what is looking like a pretty weak draft class. But Leaf, I want to start with McCullar at Kansas because fifth-year seniors are rarely in the draft conversation at all, and they're almost never in the first-round conversation. And yet here we are in late December. Kevin McCullar is not only mocked as a first-round pick virtually everywhere, there is some legitimate momentum for him as a lottery pick. 6'6", senior wing, spent 3 years at Texas Tech, last year at Kansas. This year has absolutely exploded for the Jayhawks, helping to replace that scoring they lost from Jaylon Wilson, scoring they lost from Grady Dick, doubled his points per game from 10.7 to 20.4, doubled his assists per game from 2.4 last year to 4.8 this year, while only adding a half a turnover per game. He's more effective, he's more efficient, he's a better distributor, and he was already an elite defender. And now you add in this explosive offensive game, and sure, I imagine scouts are going to be weary of a player who has only scored this effectively one of his years in college basketball. But having watched a handful of Kansas games, McCullar looks like the real deal.
Well, McCullar looks great in the college system. My concern starts and stops with his shooting. Yeah. He's shooting 40.8% from three this year, and I understand that's excellent. Mm-hmm. But if you were to look at the last couple of years, his shot was clunky and ineffective. And that's where I get concerned. Is I saw him in person at the combine, and yes, he's changed his shot. The arc's better. It's noticeable. But now the question is, how sustainable is that from further? Like the NBA line is further away than the college line. That matters. And how sustainable is it when there's less dare shots? At the beginning of the year, McCullar was a dare shooter. I think even he would admit that. Like the teams were doubling Dickinson, and they're saying, well, the rest of your team can't really shoot. Like, let's give you ones. So how effective are you in Big 12 play when you've established your 40.8% three-point shooter? Yeah. And if he's able to sustain 37%, 36%, I think he's a first-round pick. If he's not, I'm a little more concerned because I said for 3 years, I vividly remember being on the beach in San Diego, having watched Texas Tech pull out a win against Notre Dame, and they're about to play Duke. And my friend is a diehard Duke fan. And I was telling him, I want McCullar on Banchero. And then I was telling him, I was like, I'd take McCullar as an NBA guy to play like Torrey Craig. So that's been my comp for years and years. I still think he's more Torrey Craig than what he's shown in terms of his offensive ability. But in this year's class, that's a defined skill set. And there aren't that many of those that are clearly defined. So I think he is a first-round pick, but I'm a little bit lower than I would say the consensus on him.
Yeah, you kind of answered it right there at the end. That was going to be my question of like, if you are concerned about the shot, if the shot is something that is, I mean, it feels like his floor is still pretty high just because of the defensive ability he brings. So even if you're weary about the long-term effectiveness of the three-point shot, still feels like, especially in this class, he's at least a late first or early second round pick, almost at worst, just because of what he brings on the other end of the ball.
Yeah, I think just because of the athleticism and the ability to compete on one side of the ball so well, I think he buys himself a potential spot. And I think a lot of teams that are really good make those type of players better.
Yeah.
The Nuggets did it with Torrey Craig initially. I would say Bruce Brown's skill set,
Yeah.
despite being a better athlete than McCullar even, was similar. And he was paid $22 million per year this past year. So it's a lucrative skill set. The shooting needs to be real for me to truly buy it. And I have a little bit of skepticism. And I think a lot of people are quick to forget how mightily he struggled shooting the ball from three in the Big 12 at Texas Tech, and all up to the side being like, oh, he's on Kansas. And well, he's 23 and he's been a dare shooter for half the year. So there's a little context that some people are a bit overzealous about, but I think the rise and the improvement is real.
Well, this is a good transition to another prospect I want to talk about who has risen up draft boards, who is in this conversation purely for his defensive abilities, and that's Ryan Dunn at Virginia. And Dunn is not masquerading as a three-point shooter the way McCullar is. And again, maybe McCullar is legit. I don't want to diminish it, but Ryan Dunn, it's not there. He's not a shooter. He's not really an offensive player at all, but he's in this conversation. He's legitimately showing up as high as 10 on certain mock drafts. Most of the time he's in the mid-late first round. 6'8" wing, a tremendous athlete, and an elite defensive player. He's a sophomore. Last year only averaged 2.5 points per game. But Leaf, you talked about him as a breakout candidate in the ACC before the season started. That has been the case for Dunn so far. The numbers are not huge. He's only averaging 9 points per game. We're recording this before Virginia plays Morgan State on Wednesday evening, but the defensive numbers are spectacular. 2.5 blocks per game, 2.3 steals per game. He looks like a legitimate all-NBA caliber defensive player. Not saying he's going to get there, saying he looks like he has that. I've seen comparisons to Herb Jones, which I think makes a lot of sense, but there is almost no offensive game here. What do you kind of make of a prospect with as polarizing offensively and defensively as somebody like Dunn?
Yeah, the only hope offensively is that he's a sophomore, and last year he didn't redshirt, but he effectively redshirted in terms of skill set. Like he what he was just an energy guy who they asked to, like, hey, I want you to be a secondary rim protector and run the floor. And Virginia doesn't run, so it's like, okay, what is his role? And so now this year they go to media day and it's Beekman's like, well, my main contender for the reigning ACC Defensive Player of the Year is this guy over here, and he points at Ryan Dunn. And it's like a little quirky joke and whatnot, but all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, like he's actually really good and he's going to play a lot. I happen to interact a little bit with some Virginia people associated with the program, so I knew he was good. And I said last year, I want to say in the spring, it was, okay, which players that are returning to college basketball are going to be the top guys? And so a lot of people were like, oh, Filipowski, Proctor, and so many. And they're right. Those guys are the guys. And I put Dunn on that list, and it kind of shocked Rafael Barlow. I don't really know exactly where this was, but it's in May somewhere if you really want to dig it up. And my logic was just this. I said, if you can defend at a level that I think he's capable of defending, there's a place for you in the NBA. That said, I've decided most of my misses in college basketball turning to the NBA, I've had a decent track record, has been I overestimate the ability to improve as a shooter. Yeah. And I don't want to do it again. So I am lower on Dunn than I think most of the boards are right now. But it sucks to be that way, having been the highest on him of anyone, like quite literally anyone. Yeah. And so I've got him about 15 to 25. And I think his comp is defensively, it could be Jaden McDaniels. He could slide all the way, defend the rim, steal the ball, get out in transition. Offensively, he's not even close to where McCullar was last year. And he's definitely not close to what McCullar is this year. But he is 3 years younger. He is bigger, and he is more athletic. So there's a will, there's a way. I still buy him as a first-round pick, and he is a riser, no doubt about it. But it feels weird to be a little low on the guy that I picked as a riser before most people knew who he was.
Well, we're going to transition over and talk about some guys who are maybe going the other direction on some of those mock drafts. In particular, we're going to talk about Isaiah Collier, who came into the season with number 1 pick really written all over him and has not lived up to those expectations. We're going to talk about why, and a handful of other players who are kind of trending in the wrong direction after a word from today's sponsor, Game Time. Maybe you missed out on a last-minute Christmas gift for somebody special in your life. Well, good news, you are in luck with Game Time, because now you can make it up to them by buying a last-minute ticket to a big-time conference matchup or a college football playoff semifinal game. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all of the sports, music, comedy, and theater events near you, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and the best price guarantee. Game Time has exactly what you need. You should not have to worry when you're buying tickets to your next big event, and thankfully, Game Time has got you covered. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the start of the event and even an hour after the game starts. It's the place to find last-minute deals. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Leaf, moving on to talk about a couple guys who might not be going in the right direction right now. And frankly, this conversation could focus on a lot of different freshmen. There are a handful of freshmen who have moved in the right direction. Eves Missy from Baylor is one off the top of my head. Carlton Carrington kind of moved up and then has moved back down a little bit out of Pitt, but most of the freshmen are not moving in the right direction. And we kind of knew that this was a historically weak class just in terms of how scouts and analysts had kind of talked about it. And I think we're kind of seeing that bear out. And I want to start with Collier from USC. 6'5" freshman guard, the number one recruit in the country, guy who, again, many projected to be the number one overall pick or at least a top 3, top 5 pick. And he's kind of starting to fall out of that conversation. And really you can point to a couple things, but a glaring one is the turnovers. The turnover numbers were staggeringly high in the first part of the season, and they haven't come down as much as you would kind of hope they would as the season has gone on, still averaging over 4 turnovers per game for Collier. He's 4.3 assists and 4.1 turnovers. So the distribution, facilitation skills just haven't really popped in a significant way. Outside of that, the outside shooting was not considered a huge strength, but just hasn't been there at all. When you watch USC games, you can see flashes of absolute brilliance, his strength at getting to the rim, his speed, all of that is fantastic. It's easy to see why he was such a highly regarded prospect, but the overall product just has not been very good. And Leaf, outside of Collier specific struggles, I also want to ask you, how much do you think a team not performing at their expectation? USC has been one of the biggest disappointments in college basketball. How much do you think that impacts a player like Collier who's playing the point guard position? Do you think that impacts his draft stock as well, kind of coupled with everything else that's going on with him?
I do think team dynamic matters, because I haven't seen as much of USC as I thought I would, because they haven't been good, and it's just less appealing to watch. That said, I've still seen plenty of Collier, and my first impression was against Kansas State, and I said, well, you can tell. I watched it with my dad, who's not a college basketball fan necessarily, but he watches a fair amount of college basketball because he's a Stanford fan, and he likes to know what's happening in the Pac-12. And he's like, well, I can tell who's the NBA player. And I was like, and that was like, that's the best way to describe the difference of who's on the court right now. Like Tyler Perry was considered the best college player going into that, but Collier was light years better.
Yeah.
And then you watch Collier in other games, and yes, he gets to his spots easily. Yes, he can get to the rim. He hits mid-range jump shots, but none of that really looked to me like, oh, this guy's game translates well, if that makes sense. Like, does what he does at a very high level in college basketball look like an NBA point guard? And when I ask myself that, I'm a little dubious. That said, I think he's still probably a top 10 pick. Not really due to him like looking unbelievable, him shooting off the cover up the ball, him making every layup. Like, it's not that. It's that this class isn't great, and he's got a defined skill set of he can get where he wants in a basketball court. He's strong, and he's a willing passer. And I think part of the issue with him is lack of spacing, and that's something that'll be solved by the next level. So the turnovers worry me a little less than they typically would, but obviously still I'm not thrilled by a basically even 1-to-1 assist to turnover. So yes, I would describe him as someone who's slipping, but I wouldn't say it's a catastrophic fall. Like Justin Edwards to me is plummeting, like absolutely plummeting. That said, I didn't have him high to begin with, but my goodness, is this a steep fall?
Yeah, let's talk about Edwards then, because I had a kind of a handful of other freshmen on the list here. Stephon Castle, who is falling in part because of an injury, in part because the role is less defined because UConn's got really good guards, and Tristan Newton and Cam Spencer. Castle's kind of on that list, but I think he could probably rebuild some value. And then, Edwards and to an extent, DJ Wagner. Funny thing, we talked about this before we hit the record button. You could do a show of 2 risers, 2 fallers, 2 sleepers, literally just from Kentucky players. If you did Reed Shepherd, Rob Dillingham as your risers, you could do Justin Edwards, DJ Wagner as your fallers. You could do Zvonimir Ivisic and Antonio Reeves as your sleepers, and it would fill out an entire show. But Edwards in particular, I think, has had the most kind of jarring drop, and really it's a product of watching Kentucky games. There's not a really standout skill. The outside shot is not there. The ball handling is certainly not there. He doesn't pass the ball particularly well. He's a very, very good athlete, but every year it feels like there's a couple freshmen who kind of just continue to disappear onto the draft. I don't know if Edwards is going to come back, but at this point, I mean, to me, even in a weak class, he barely looks like a first-round pick, and I'm not sure mocks that still have him in the lottery or late first. I think they're just maybe slow to adjust because he does not look like that guy.
Here's a question for you. I just thought of it as you were talking. Does he look like Chris Livingston a bit, like athletic and strong, but then ends up going the 55th pick or somewhere thereabouts?
Yeah, I don't know if Livingston never had this hype that I recall.
Yeah. No, he didn't. But like that's who he reminds me of playing.
Yeah, I know. I see the comparison.
Yeah,
I kind of like that comp actually, and I think that was good for Livingston to end up in a no pressure situation where he might be able to develop a little bit behind the scenes. Even Milwaukee, if I remember right, and I think that would be great for Edwards, but I don't think he could disappear like that. Like if he fell to like 48th, he would get talked about as somebody who fell as much as he did. And I hope that he could find a way to flesh that and develop in like a G League type setting and become that guy. Cause I think that the talent is there, but yeah, his performance this year has just not looked like the guy you'd be willing to take a top 5 pick on, which is where he was kind of consensus mocked before the season began.
Here's what I think happens for Edwards. I think Edwards to me was overhyped by product of going to Kentucky, by product of a lesser class. And they said, well, this guy is big, he's athletic, he's strong, and he's got the capacity to shoot. Like it doesn't look terrible. And then he's going to Kentucky. So let's hype him up because what's worked in the NBA recently is wings. So even though Dillingham and Wagner were going there, the one that seemed to generate the most buzz for NBA scouts would be Edwards. So I watched the blue-white scrimmage game. I've said this on NBA Big Board a number of times. I think I've told you and Isaac this story too. And I watched the blue-white scrimmage game, and I looked at my friend who's the same guy, Duke fan. And I look at him, and he watched a ton of high school basketball. I look at him and say, he can't dribble. Like I was shocked. And if you watch the blue-white scrimmage, he loses the ball like 6 times, and I'm baffled. And I know people have bad games, but losing your dribble in a scrimmage is alarming. And then I watched him shoot, and I don't like his shot. He's an active guy. He's a rebounder. And I wonder if he came in as like a 50th ranked recruit and then he was playing like the 6th man or the 5th starter role. If they'd be like, man, I like his intangibles. I'm curious about his skill set. And he'd end up being like a top 20 pick. But that's what I think he's going to be. I think he's going to be a top 20 pick. And people are going to like what he can do in an open gym setting because you didn't get to see it at Kentucky because they had better players. I'd be tentative to take him myself. Like if it's my team, I'd be like, oh boy, like he better check a lot of character tests. And I'm not saying that as if I know anything. I hope he's a great guy. By all accounts, he is. It's just difficult to imagine going from number 1 pick type of candidate by a lot of big boards, and some of those from those I respect, and to now being, like you said, not a first round pick in your eyes. And I also really respect that. So yeah, he's taken a tremendous slide. And then you mentioned Castle. Castle, I also am lower on, but I just wonder if he were to go to a school that said, hey, here's the ball, what you'd see, because he's strong, he's big, he barrels to the rim. Why couldn't he be like Collier? If he was on a team that wasn't top 5 in the country, good, with a point guard like Tristan Newton. But yeah, I just haven't been impressed by his burst. That said, he got injured. So I think he's just too much of an unknown. I think by February and March, I think we'll have a good idea on what Stephon Castle is. But right now, to me, he's on the fringe of the lottery looking down. Like trending downward for me.
I want to close out the show discussing a couple of sleepers, a handful of guys who, particularly upperclassmen, as we've kind of seen a lot more in just the modern NBA, more guys like, Jaime Jaquez getting drafted and having a lot of success, Brandon Pajemski, veteran guys who succeed right away in the NBA. So we got a handful of guys, a couple from the Pac-12 in particular, who are actually playing each other on Friday evening that we're going to discuss. Coming up after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. As the weather gets colder, the college basketball offers stay hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time than right now to get in on the action. The app is super easy to use. There is a wide range of betting options, which includes spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. We're going to be talking about an Arizona prospect momentarily. And if you're a believer, you can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, drop some cash on Arizona plus 230 to take home the national championship and get yourself in on the action this college basketball season. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, Leaf, handful of sleepers we want to talk about. I know this is everybody's kind of favorite topic, is who are those guys who might sneak into the second round, might sneak all the way up into the first round. I know you've talked about a handful of guys that aren't on a lot of boards right now, or are kind of maybe on the back of some boards that you have as potential first round grades. And we had a couple of Pac-12 guys that I wanted to start with, a couple wings here, one from Cal, that's Jaylon Tyson. The other one, a wing from Arizona, Pelle Larsson in particular. If those of you who have been with us from the very, very beginning, the second ever episode of Locked On College Basketball Podcast, me and my co-host Isaac Shade discussed some of our bold predictions for the season. I talked about Larsson being a potential Pac-12 Player of the Year candidate. This was last year. He did not reach that threshold, but he has looked very solid this year. Meanwhile, Tyson, averaging just under 20 points per game, has finally been kind of unlocked as an offensive player at Cal after starting his career at Texas and then having some significant issues with the coaching staff at Texas Tech last year, getting to get a waiver to play right away at Cal and has looked really good. Leaf, between those two guys, just kind of what are you seeing from them as guys who are not really in the draft conversation that much yet, that kind of has you excited about them as potential NBA players?
Yeah, I'm not sure why they're not as in mainstream conversations. They're both athletic wings who have offensive skill. Like that's exactly what the NBA prioritizes right now. Every single team in the NBA looks for those attributes. I think Pelle Larsson is very similar to Christian Brown. Like very, very similar.
Yeah,
and I'm not saying that just because they're of the same ethnicity. I'm saying that because they're both athletic, wired to cut to the rim, rebounders who have the capacity to shoot. I think Brown's probably a slightly better athlete, but Larsson's probably a better natural shooter. And they're both slashers. I think Brown's the best player in Arizona, and Arizona's a top 5 team in the country. There's a lot of love for Boswell in the first round. I look at Tankathon right now. He's number 26. I think the more appealing skill set is that of Pelle Larsson. He's big. He slashes defensively. He takes on the best player every single time. He rebounds. He runs the floor. He doesn't mope. And when they when they lost the other day to FAU, he was the only player I was like, man, that sucks, because he was defending really hard.
Yeah.
He was wide open all the time. They probably would have won in single overtime if they would have passed him the ball when he was under the hoop. And then, Caleb Love had his moments, but he shot 25 or 26 shots and scored 25 points. Anyway, back to the NBA draft perspective. I think he's just got a skill set for winning that impacts winning. And that's like, he shoots the ball well enough and he's athletic. Jaylon Tyson, I'm a little more high on than even Pelle Larsson, even though his team is terrible. Like Cal is awful. But Jaylon Tyson's got a really interesting skill set to me. He plays hard. He gets to the rim. He's got the ball in his hands more than Pelle Larsson does. Pelle Larsson obviously is put in really good situations because all he has to do is like slash and run, and that's not exactly sustainable at the NBA level. But Jaylon Tyson has the ability to create for himself, and I believe that he can create for others. And then defensively, I think it's hard to really register what he is because his team is so inadequate. You don't see him defending in a way that like it's like, oh, well, there's another stop led by Jaylon Tyson's excellent on-ball defense. They just don't attack him. And you don't want to be like, oh, they're avoiding him because he's so good. But I'll tell you this, Jaylon Tyson is able to create for himself, and he's been efficient doing it. Like, I'm looking at some recent games. Ever since he stepped foot in the very first game, he was 7 of 11 from the field. Like, he's able to do that. Now you look at some of the more competent teams against Ole Miss, who I've been high on for all year. I've had them ranked the last 3 weeks. They're ranked in the AP poll now, 9-17, and that's a good defense coached by Chris Beard. He shot against Butler 6 of 13, 8 of 12 against Santa Clara. San Diego State 9 of 21, Tulane 7 of 12. So all these games, he's able to score for both for twos and threes, and he's got the length. I'm curious to see what his wingspan turns out to. I'm not typically like a metrics guy, but if he's got good length, I think he'll really skyrocket up boards because he's got great coordination and speed for his size. And so I think there's just a fluidity. So those are the two Pac-12 ones, which are close to home, and I think they're a little lesser known players, but they're probably just as equally well known prospects as some of the next couple guys who are upperclassmen that are thriving more in the ones in the middle of America, so to speak, and the other two in the Atlantic Coast Conference.
Yeah, I'm a big Tyson fan. I think it'd be a mistake if a team didn't take him in the first round. He strikes me as a guy somewhat similar to what Denver has done recently, where they seem to just grab these late first round pick wings who immediately thrive. Braun's an example. Strother from Gonzaga is an example. Peyton Watson was obviously a younger prospect, but a similar example too. Like, if you're in the late first and you're trying to contend and you got a 6'7" guard who can create his own shot and is likely a capable defender. I agree with you. We haven't seen that much. Like, I would absolutely be all over Tyson. And Larsson, the volume of 3-point shots isn't really there. And I know some NBA analysts have said they want to see him shoot more. I don't know if that's going to happen for him in Arizona's offense with the guards that he plays with, but it's hard to argue with his effectiveness and his efficiency so far. I think both those guys are absolutely draftable players. And Leaf, I know you have a couple of other sleeper picks that you want to talk about too, and I want to kind of give you an opportunity to toss some of those names out there. Some guys who again have been in college for a couple of years, who are good 3-point shooters, which is obviously a valuable skill in the NBA, and guys who might sneak into that first round conversation that aren't really being talked about there right now.
Yeah, let me preface this by saying I have the 3 guys I'm about to mention as first round picks. So to me, they're not terribly deep sleepers. I just think compared to consensus, many players don't. Or many scouts don't see them this way. The first one being Baylor Shireman. I did an episode with Isaac maybe a week ago, saying he's an All-American to me. And I think Kalkbrenner is probably the most important to Creighton. And most people would have said Alexander was the Creighton player most likely to be a first-round pick. But I've got it as Baylor Shireman. He's big. He shoots the lights out. He rebounds. He's a better defender than I think he's advertised for, which once again I think is a narrative thing. He's someone that has at every level of basketball, I think he makes the right play. And if you give him more space, I think he's an even better driver. I think he looks decent as an athlete. I think he's a really excellent rebounder. He attacks the ball. And rebounding is something I typically like in the wing, and I'll always elevate a player for it, and usually it helps my evaluation. I think his 37% 3-point shooting percentage is underrating his talent for shooting because he's kind of the bailout guy. And I also believe that he's got this offensive savvy that's pretty rare. I think at the worst of the NBA, he's like a George Niang, someone who had a big role in college, steps out, shoots the lights out, defends as hard as he can, rebounds a little bit, and has a solid body. I think there's a little bit of Jaime Jaquez to him in the sense that he's not quite the creative scorer isolation-wise as Jaquez, but he's someone who just excels at every level of basketball he's played. And at a certain point, you're going to see that at the NBA. The next guy I've actually got a couple. I'll just rattle through a few of them and tell me where to stop. I like AJ Mitchell of UC Santa Barbara. UC Santa Barbara I saw in person, and they were playing Baylor, and he got the better of Keontae George, who's on my favorite team, the Utah Jazz, and he's been really good. He was better than Adam Flagler. He was better than LJ Cryer in that game. He's a long Belgian point guard who's a tremendous athlete, and he's a creative distributor. So I think he's someone who could crack a first round. I'm a little less sold than him. Then I've got Wooga Poplar. That's another guy I've got a firm first round grade on. Wooga Poplar is second in the nation right now in 3-point shooting. And I would argue he's a better athlete than he is like a form shooter. Like his best shot, according to his coach, Jim Larinaga, is a mid-range jump shot. That's not a shot that exactly is a steady diet for a guy who'd come in as a rookie in the NBA. So what's he doing? He's shooting 51% from 3. He's a really good athlete. I believe in his rebounding. I believe in his defense. And the last guy, I like Dalton Connect as a first rounder. Even though he's cooled off a bit throughout the season and he's not a great athlete, his dribble's not great, he can shoot the lights out. He's big enough. He's crafty enough. And at a certain point, you just got to put the ball in the hole. So who are you looking at as comparable players in this range? Guys that don't shoot the ball well. And I know a lot of people are going to give me slack. Like Terrence Shannon Jr. is probably an All-American this year, but why am I lower on him even though they're both 23 years old? Well, Terrence Shannon has had a track record of really poor shooting for years.
Yeah.
Terrence Shannon only goes left. Dalton Connect's bigger than Terrence Shannon. Terrence Shannon doesn't pass. So those are a couple of reasons there. There's other guys that are in this same category, like Kobe Johnson, a lot of people, Trevon Brazile. Well, why are they better players than Dalton Connect? Because they're more athletic, but they haven't used their athleticism to do anything.
Yeah.
And so I really like his possibility of rising up draft boards just because of his shooting ability. And Tennessee is a team that's going to play great defense, so they can instill good habits in him defensively.
Yeah. That's great analysis on those guys, Leaf. I'm really excited to, as we get closer and closer to the draft, to continue to have these conversations, look at some of these prospects through that lens as we get, through conference play into the NCAA tournament, and of course, into the off season before the draft rolls around. So thanks so much for coming on the show, of course, as our weekly show and getting a chance to talk about these draft guys. But that's going to wrap it up for us today. Isaac and I will be back on Friday with a preview of these weekend games, including San Diego State and Gonzaga, and a really nice matchup between Creighton and Marquette in the Big East. All that coming up on Friday's show. And then we will be back with you in 2024 after that to get ready for the start of conference play across all of college basketball. Thanks so much to those of you who are everyday listeners. Thanks to those of you who have joined us on our Discord channel. If you have not, there is a link in the show notes. It is free to join. You can come hang out with Leaf, myself, and Isaac all the time talking college hoops. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, as always, peace out.